Good afternoon. My name is Aomar Boum. I am professor of anthropology and Near Eastern languages and cultures, and Maurice Amado Chair in Sephardic Studies at UCLA. On behalf of the UCLA L&D Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I would like to welcome you to the Maurice Amado program in Sephardic Studies, highlighting Professor Charles McDonald. Dr. McDonald holds the Sava Ranisavljevic Postdoctoral Fellowship in Judeo-Spanish Studies at Northwestern University, where he is appointed in Spanish, Jewish Studies, and Anthropology. Before joining Northwestern, he was a postdoctoral fellow in Jewish Studies at Rice University. He received his PhD in Anthropology and Historical Studies at the New School for Social Research, where he also serves as the Managing Director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. His research has been supported by the Social Sciences Research Council, Wenner-Gren Foundation, Posen Foundation, and the Center for Jewish History, among others. His most recent article, Ranker, Sephardic Jews, Spanish Citizenship and the Politics of Sentiment, is recently published in Comparative Studies in Society and History. He's currently finishing his first book, Return to Sepharad, which is an experimental ethnography of the return of Jews and Judaism in contemporary Spain. An anthropologist of modern Spain, Dr. McDonald is here today to share with us his work on the phenomena of Sephardi Jews and the politics of Spanish citizenship. Scholars writing about the Iberian citizenship laws have argued that we need to investigate how applying for citizenship has often prompted Sephardi descendants to rethink their ancestry, identity, and attachment. But what about those who chose not to apply? How should we read their decisions? Based on ethnographic work and fieldwork with prospective citizenship seekers, this talk reads the refusal of citizenship as a political claim. Dr. McDonald argues that any reckoning with the Iberian citizenship laws is incomplete without an analysis of how people negotiate citizenship and its attendant claims, particularly when states prompted citizenship as a form of historical reparation. We will begin by a short talk by Dr. McDonald, and then we'll follow up with a short session of Q&A. Dr. McDonald, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Boum, and the Center for having me. I'm delighted to share some of this work, which is extracted from a chapter in my book manuscript. So I'll talk for about 20 minutes, then I think we can switch to a larger conversation. In August of 2016, I received an email from Tony, a Sephardi American expatriate living in Madrid. Have you seen this? Attached was an article recently published in Spain's newspaper of record, El País, titled, "Only 2,424 Sephardim have applied for Spanish citizenship." I'd first met Tony 6 months earlier when I interviewed him about his experience as an applicant under Spain's 2015 Sephardic citizenship law. We had remained in regular contact as he had allowed me to literally and figuratively look over his shoulder while he moved through the application process. His email found me not long after I'd arrived back in New York from a year spent conducting fieldwork and archival research. Although I'd been making research trips to Spain since 2010, I'd envisioned this most recent visit as the culmination of my dissertation fieldwork, which I had timed to coincide with the law's first year. Tony had long been critical of various aspects of the law, including what he considered its overly stringent qualifications, a poorly designed application platform, an unwieldy bureaucratic structure, the application fees, and the often unavoidable expense of hiring lawyers and genealogists, and the fact that the law itself was temporary rather than permanent. Given that Jewish leaders and government officials had offered estimates for the total number of petitions they might receive that ranged from anywhere from 90,000 to 500,000, media outlets and Sephardi Jews alike registered surprise at numbers that were considerably lower than expected. The El País article was an early example of a string of media reports over the next few years that suggested that the law was garnering fewer applicants than anticipated due to many of the same issues that Tony had identified. In keeping with other media assessments of the law, the article concluded the typical cost, which is 3,000 to 5,000 euros, combined with the other requirements, which I won't go into in depth here, but they included genealogical documentation, proof of a quote special connection with Spain, language and culture tests, and travel to Spain to sign the completed application, would likely dissuade seniors and people of limited means from applying. These bureaucratic and financial obstacles were compounded by poor preparation, inadequate staffing, and an unreliable, to say the least, online submission portal. For all these reasons, the article warned that the law risked ending up as a quote fiasco. As the kicker in the article put it, la nostalgia de Sefarad tira mucho, pero no tanto. Nostalgia for Sefarad pulls hard, but not that hard. Other gravities, other claims. In the 2015 law's preamble, as well as in the rhetoric of state and religious authorities, sentiments like nostalgia and love are ascribed to Sephardi descendants, even as the claim that they feel no, quote, rancor towards Spain for the expulsion is anxiously repeated. And this is a subject of another recent article of mine. In this talk, I'm less concerned with how the Spanish state has envisioned the emotions and attachments of its would-be subjects than with the discrepancies between these visions and those expressed by Sephardi descendants themselves. Scholars writing about the Sephardic citizenship laws in Spain and Portugal have rightly argued that we need to attend to the ways the act of applying for citizenship has often prompted Sephardi descendants to rethink their ancestry, identity, and attachments. But what about those who chose not to apply? How should we read their decisions? Why might it appear preferable or even necessary to refuse the offer of citizenship? And what can those perspectives add to our understanding of the ways that people negotiate citizenship and its claims, particularly in scenarios where states promote the offer of citizenship as a form of historical reparation? So this talk is about those Sephardi descendants for whom nostalgia hardly pulled at all, or for whom its pull was insufficient to counteract other forces. This is not to discount the many Sephardi descendants who welcomed these laws for a wide range of reasons, nor do I wish to overlook the significant challenges the application process presented for Sephardi descendants. Scholars in a range of fields have pointed out how the law disregards the heterogeneous ways that Sephardi descendants reckon belonging, by instead claiming the Spanish nation state as the primary frame for thinking about Sephardic origins and attachments. The law has also elicited strong critiques for its exclusion of Muslims and Morisco descendants from similar forms of legislation. Less frequently addressed has been the question of Sephardi descendants who were eligible, had the means to apply, but chose not to. I argue that any reckoning with the politics of citizenship as reparation is incomplete without including the experiences of Sephardi descendants who refuse this offer. My aim then is to consider the conditions of possibility for such decisions and some of the ways that my interlocutors made sense of them, whether they take the form of explicit rejections, pointed critiques, or general indifference. I read these refusals as political claims. Such claims may also be cautionary, enjoining scholars against inadvertently reproducing the very rhetorics that the Sephardic citizenship laws have summoned and in some cases reanimated. Of particular concern, I suggest, are invocations of symbolic reparation or reconciliation as done deeds, since such assertions about the workings of justice failed to resonate with some of the descendants that will meet in this talk. So before I finish, or before I continue rather, I just want to give you a quick sort of note on the methods I used and how the fieldwork for this project went. So in the 3 years following Tony's 2016 email and the end of my long discontinuous period of fieldwork, I stayed in touch with him and several dozen other interlocutors. These included the diverse and continually shifting members of various Jewish communities in Spain, religious and government authorities there, expatriate Jews like Tony, who'd been living in Spain for years, Jewish students and tourists, and Sephardi descendants in the diaspora. Since the law was first announced in 2012, I also conducted roughly 40 interviews with Sephardi descendants from Venezuela, Turkey, France, Brazil, Israel, Mexico, Argentina, the UK, and the US. Most of these were conducted online. This is before the era of COVID, so perhaps it was good training. And a few of them took place in person. So this talk is informed by these relationships and conversations, as well as the ethnographic and archival research that forms the book project on the return to Sepharad, of which this story about citizenship law is just one part, one half. Really. So here I focus on two exchanges, which I believe help reveal the underexplored theme of refusal among Sephardi descendants. I do not, nor could I hope to, speak to the full spectrum of reasons why people didn't apply the Spanish law, an option that's no longer available, or have not yet applied to the Portuguese counterpart, which is still an option that's on the table. Sephardi descendants understood the law, its promise of return, and their relations to it in many different ways. So this talk draws on the words of two interlocutors, not to claim them as representative cases, but rather to track some of the flashpoints where unsettled histories, personal experience, and collective imaginings collide to animate a politics of refusal. So next part, refusing absolution. Alexandra was a middle-aged Sephardic American woman with piercing blue-gray eyes and an intense energy that was both commanding and charming. We met in September of 2016 at a New York bakery known for its excellent vodka. Wedging ourselves into two sides of a tiny white table, we made small talk as I retrieved my notebook and recorder and prepared to begin interviewing her about what I understood as her plans to apply for Spanish citizenship. I was thrown off when instead she began grilling me. Why was Spain doing this? Why was it limited to a 3-year window? How were they determining who was Sephardic? Would she be absolving Spain of its past by applying? If the first three questions were ones I had been grappling with for some time, the last one surprised me because it centered not on what the abstract entity of Spain wanted, but on what Sephardi Jews in the diaspora might not want. Until that point, it hadn't occurred to me that anyone who could take advantage of the law might choose not to. I had taken for granted that it was the ethical position of the state that was most pressing. She brought a more expansive notion of ethics into view, one that was rooted in the agency of potential Spanish subjects and that presupposed an already present obligation of the state to Sephardi descendants. She told me that she was concerned about the unwarranted legitimacy that her application might confer on a law that she and other Jews found wanting on moral and historical grounds. Although she had agreed to meet me because she was thinking about applying, by the end of the conversation, she seemed certain that she would be doing no such thing. She seemed disappointed or perhaps indignant, as if she had retroactively been betrayed and was already anticipating a betrayal that had not yet fully materialized. She was reasoning, it seemed to me, through sentiments. Theoretical approaches associated with the affective turn have largely failed to address the discrepancies between the sentiments and attachments sanctioned by the state in the name of citizenship and those that subjects, or in this case would-be subjects, actually experience. Alexandra's investments are opaque from the perspective of theories that draw arbitrary distinctions between affect and emotion, or between either of these and reason. Given the ways in which affect theory has reproduced mind-body dualisms, it may be more helpful to think with sentiments. Jan Stoler has defined as, quote, judgments, assessments, and interpretations of the social and political world. To speak of sentiments is to recognize that Alexandra's emotive and ethical deliberations are already part of the same history as the Spanish state's appeal to nostalgia, and thus ought to be brought into the same analytic frame. Not only did Alexandra maintain that applying would be tantamount to absolving Spain of its historical responsibility to Sephardi Jews, she told me that she had also been dissuaded by the fact that Spain had not made the long-term investments in education, infrastructure, and social welfare that would be necessary to combat anti-Semitism and make the settlement of new Jewish citizens in Spain viable. Her sense of the poverty of the law and its lack of institutional support emerged in part from her work with an NGO that worked on issues of historical memory and human rights. For her, post-Holocaust Germany offered a model for atonement, reconciliation, and material support that Spain could have followed if it had been more serious about the return of Jews. And this was a position taken by a number of people I spoke with. Since nothing in the spirit or the letter of Spain's now expired law, expired in October 1st, 2019, so if nothing in the spirit or the letter of the law resembles a right of return as established in other contexts, the citizenship it offers is better understood, I argue, as a gift, one which attempts to foreclose rather than address the question of reparations. While classic anthropologist Marcel Mauss understood the refusal of a gift as ending relations, Carol McGranahan has asked us to consider refusal as a generative act, a rearrangement of relations rather than an ending of them. In the case she describes, exiled Tibetans have preemptively refused citizenship in India and Nepal for decades on the grounds that it might void their claims on Tibet. Her work in turn is informed by the work of Audra Simpson, who's theorized how indigenous people participate in, quote, calculated refusals of the gifts of the state and in vexed determinations of membership and belonging in that state, end quote. So this is a different sort of refusal than we're used to thinking about, one that decenters the state as the only grounds for thinking the political and inquires instead into how it is productive for those who refuse. While the relationship of Sephardi descendants to Spain and Portugal and the political stakes of their refusal is, of course, quite distinct from Tibetan refugees or indigenous Iroquois, there are important resonances. Any state's power to grant citizenship is founded on inequality. This is perhaps especially clear when citizenship takes the form of a gift bestowed rather than a right demanded or enforced. Refusal recasts that relationship of inequality in favor of a political otherwise. Alexandra evidently did not feel the nostalgia for Spain that state discourses suggested she would or should. The affective states I discerned in our conversation had less to do with Spain's history and more to do with its present failure to acknowledge that history. Her indignation arose in response to what she and so many other Sephardi descendants saw as Spain's superficial treatment of historical justice and the reparative work required to enact it. Suspicious of what the acceptance of Spanish citizenship entailed, she refused to even apply. If Alexandra was being pulled at all, it was not by nostalgia for Sepharad, but by her attachments to other Jews and her awareness of the ways that citizenship so often denies rather than confers rights. The pull of these ethical demands envisioned a more honest, comprehensive, and lasting reparative politics for Sephardi descendants, one that might be possible someday, but not, to her mind, under the conditions of the 2015 law. Indifference. Another set of concerns animated my conversation with Casey, a Sephardi American in his mid-30s. When we spoke, he highlighted his relative privilege as an American, even at a time when anti-Semitism in the US had risen dramatically since Trump's 2016 election. As he observed, quote, of all the people who deserve reparations of any kind from the state that has an opportunity to give those reparations, I guess we're low on the list. It's not like we're refugees. It's not a pressing concern, at least not here. While having a Spanish passport and the mobility that it conferred was not a pressing concern in New York, it was in Venezuela, where much of Casey's family still lived. Quote, they're kind of screwed. All of their property and assets are in Venezuela, but they want to leave really badly. And yet, as he explained, his Venezuelan family members were unlikely to avail themselves of either the Spanish or Portuguese citizenship offers. While his family deeply identified as Sephardi Jews, he explained that theirs was, quote, not a deep-seated connection to Spain. their attachments lay elsewhere. Quote, especially because my Venezuelan family are Jews now, they're not crypto Jews. If they needed to get out, I think they'd say either America or Israel. Spain would be pretty low on their list. When I asked him why Spain was such an improbable choice for them, he explained that Israel or America would be easier transitions, since his family had networks in both countries. But their disinterest in Spain or Portugal was not only a matter of familiarity and convenience. Quote, from an emotional standpoint even, he told me, I think they would want to be in Israel versus Spain or Portugal. If it were more of a refugee issue, it would be those places versus the desire to have a passport. So why those places, I asked. Casey explained that there were more Jews in the US and Israel, but beyond that, his family, quote, identifies with a global Jewish culture more than they identify with a more provincial Sephardi or Spanish culture. I asked Casey whether his parents, who lived in the US and were eligible for both laws, would consider applying. With a half smile, he shook his head no. His father and grandmother were still Dutch citizens. They weren't, quote, concerned or interested in the Iberian legislation because they felt, as he put it, no need to reconcile, which, as the language of the law, of course, suggested they would or should. For Casey's parents and grandparents, there was no inevitable or even predictable correspondence between Sephardi ancestry and national attachments. Rather, emotional connections, as he put it, and a number of other people did, are the result of pre-existing relationships and modes of reckoning with history and solidarity. For them, Spain and Portugal are abstract provincial places. Whatever pull they may have had for earlier generations of Sephardi Jews is eclipsed by the lively social and economic ties his family has with Israel and the US today. The older generations in his family simply don't consider Spain or Portugal as important nodes in a global Jewish culture. So his family harbored neither nostalgia nor rancor for Spain, nor any other sentiments. Despite his American family's anxieties about Trump and his Venezuelan family's increasingly desperate situation, they chose not to apply for either of the Iberian citizenship laws. Their refusal took the form of indifference. And let me just sum up quickly and then move into the discussion. So in this talk, I've considered how some Sephardi descendants respond to the gift of citizenship, the quandaries it occasions, and the opportunities it may provide for thinking and doing politics otherwise. In different ways, these brief ethnographic vignettes foreground discrepancy as a galvanizing force for sentiments and actions. The stories unfolded by Alexandra and Casey echo something I found in my other fieldwork as well. Spain's Sephardic citizenship law has a way of disturbing the very histories of exile and diaspora that it claims to ameliorate or even supersede. Ironically, by casting Sephardi descendants as essentially Spanish in a fantasy of national integration and redemption, the central narrative that the law seeks to enact undermines itself. Like any mechanism for granting citizenship, Spain's law aims to identify and secure the right kinds of national subjects, whether through the explicit criteria for inclusion that determine who counts as a Sephardi Jew or descendant, or the tacit exclusion of Muslims and Rusca descendants, not to mention the obstacles that were created in the sort of bureaucratic process for applications. So the plural Sephardi histories I encountered in my fieldwork were entangled in multiple diasporas and empires, entanglements that were obscured by the neat list of nations where Sephardi descendants were, or were not, applying for Spanish citizenship. For many of my interlocutors, the law articulated a normative correspondence between sentiment and attachment that bore little resemblance to their lives. The discrepancy between their conceptions of Sephardi history, identity, and reparative justice and those embedded in the law triggered a profound misrecognition. Individual feelings of misrecognition existed alongside, of course, and sometimes in tension with other more positive feelings. For some of the Sephardi descendants I came to know, the law's failure to correspond with what they knew and how they felt prompted them to reassess how they might relate to Spain and even to citizenship itself. For more than a century, philo-Sephardic thinkers had promoted the return of Sephardi Jews as the solution to many of Spain's problems, even as they fretted about the possibility that Jews continued to harbor, quote, rancor for the expulsion because they refused to let go of the past. But the refusal enacted by the Sephardi descendants I've described here was born not of an irrational emotional attachment to the injuries of the past, right? As perhaps Nietzsche would put it, and many of these thinkers were very much influenced by Nietzsche's theories, but of the inequities of the present. Rather than breaking with the past to reconcile and repair, the law appeared to some of my interlocutors as a continuity. They refused the gift of citizenship not as a rebuke of Spain's history, but of its unilateral transformation of that history, such that what many of them saw as an inadequate or cynical gesture of atonement could be presented as a resolution. By attending to Sephardi refusals, I argue we're better able to take stock of a more complicated geography of belonging and ethical relations than envisioned by Spain's law. Thanks so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Cam, for this excellent teaser, I would say. But it's a really, it's very short, but it's really, there's a lot to unpack here. That's the beauty of, I think that's the beauty of your anthropological work. First of all, I'm really happy that an anthropologist is trying to tackle these issues. I am happy with the work that a lot of historians have been doing. And there are so many of them. But I think it's really to see you in the mix of this work. I think you're adding a lot of stuff. You're really not only adding, but also your intervention is really important. And I would even go as far as saying a cutting edge intervention. So I want to start, before we get to some of the points that you discuss in this brief piece, but it's a really excellent piece. If we can go back a little bit and then in order to help the audience understand this big context you're working with.
Sure.
Before we talk about the law of the 2015, I personally was very familiar with the law of 1949, the Franco law, but I'm not as informed as what was happening in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So if you can enlighten us a little bit more about this history of Spain's attempt to, quote unquote, bring back its Jews.
Sure.
What would you say?
So, one of the things that I think is surprising, and particularly for, I think, folks working in other areas in Jewish studies, and even potentially for anthropologists and historians of Spain, is we tend to associate Spain with the Inquisition, right, and with this sort of eternal hatred or anti-Semitism as pre-modern, as backwards, etc. And so one of the things that's really curious is that in the late 19th and early 20th century, we see this sort of reappraisal of Spain's Jewish history by Spanish scholars, thinkers, early sort of proto-anthropologists. And in conjunction with anthropological thinking by the sort of 20s and 30s, there's this idea that if Spain can bring back the Jews, that Jews sort of have within them the racial qualities of Spain at its height. And this is a view that's really endorsed primarily by sort of liberals, in the classical sense, and that if we can bring the Jews back to Spain, Spain will be somehow redeemed. It's sort of a version of a sort of like the good or the charitable anti-Semitism we're familiar with, right? Like smart, industrious Jews will come back, but it also depends on this very curious idea of racial fusion. That that blood and ancestry and kinship sort of contain Spanish culture. So in this narrative, Sephardi Jews are very much cast as Spaniards, right? And sort of their connections to other Jews are totally sort of put to the side. And so one of the things that I argue in the book that I'm finishing now is that the 2015 law kind of very much participates in this longer genealogy, where this ends up being very much about what can the Jews do for Spain, right? rather than is there a truly some kind of reparative work the laws do.
So would you say that some of these early attempts were triggered by a particular crisis of identity or an economic crisis that would allow or that would push some of these Spanish nationalists, Democrat and not Democrat, to push for at least or to propose this idea to Jews worldwide?
Yeah, so there are two pivotal historical moments that I think are important. One is sort of the final end of the Spanish Empire as it had existed in 1898. So the loss of that empire, and the intellectuals that grappled with what that meant and how to sort of recover, right? Because to be a good European state meant to be a world empire. And the other is encounters that Spaniards had with Sephardi Jewish descendants in North Africa during one of several colonial wars in Morocco in 1859.
1860, probably.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that was a moment when Spanish intellectuals in particular filtered through sort of war diaries, sort of became aware that there were these lost Spaniards. And a whole discourse about recovering them and how much they longed for Spain and the Queen, et cetera, really proliferated at the end of the 19th century. So I think those two things together, along with the rise of anthropology as a discipline in Spain, kind of created this perfect brew, I think, for a project of repatriation. One of the people that led this was Angel Pulido, who was a senator, a physician. He also trained as an anthropologist early in his career, and he's sort of the main figure who popularizes this idea of return to Sephora. And I should add just really briefly, like this isn't all. There are many Sephardic people in parts of the world advocating for return too. This wasn't only a sort of nationalist state project, but it's sort of it's overdetermined by how much it was pushed by intellectuals and thinkers in Spain.
So would you the last point I want to say about this early period, would you say that this preference of the Jew versus the Muslim or Maurice or the Moor has always been part of this discourse from the beginning of this discourse, or there is a mixing?
So I would say that what I would say has been important, certainly in the modern period, is a distinction between the Jew and the Muslim, or the Jew and the Arab, or the the Converso and the Morisco. But like what those distinctions have been and how they have mattered have shifted, I think, back and forth quite a bit. And so at different moments, I think one or the other of those kind of two sort of bifurcated history of conversion and exile, certain parts have been valorized and denigrated, and that's kind of changed over time. So there's certainly moments when there's a lot of investment by Spanish intellectuals and leaders in it was often called the brotherhood, right, with North Africans, for example. But like as with the Sephardi Jews, it sort of comes and goes. It waxes and wanes, that attachment, and it often, maybe not always, but it often dovetails with imperial ambitions, with ways to think of, well, how can we make Spain great again? And I think that's the case now, that it's not this sort of it's not a constant dyad that remains the same, but there is this kind of tacit comparison between the Jew and the Muslim in this kind of discourse of who gets to return, whose return will improve the state, etc.
Well, that's fascinating, because that leads me to another point, I think, which is reading your work, one of the points that you really highlight, and I want to know more, I want to hear more about what you want to say, what you can say about this, is this distinction you make clearly about Philo-Sephardism and Philo-Semitism. Can you elaborate a little bit to our reader more on why this distinction is central to your work, and
right.
what kind of propositions you try and explanation and work you try to lay out here for the readership?
So I would put it this way. So particularly in the early 20th century, as these ideas about recovering lost, so-called lost Jews, lost Sephardic Jews gain salience and popularity, what often happens is that Sephardi Jews are positioned as good Jews, right, versus Ashkenazi Jews. So Sephardi Jews, because of their history with Spanish culture and language and these sort of metaphysical ideas about territorial origins, they have been made good by their association with the Spaniards in this imagination. Whereas, a lot of the sort of typical anti-Semitic rhetoric we're familiar with toward Jews is attributed to Ashkenazi Jews. And I should say, this is really, for the most, not wholly, but for the most part, this is a project of sort of liberal thinkers, people who are very much in favor of trying to who feel that Spain has been left behind the rest of European modernity, and Sephardi Jews in particular, offer for them a way to reinsert Spain into this narrative of a good modern European nation. But of course, there are plenty of thinkers for whom the Jews continue to be seen as a threat, right? And there's a lot of ambivalence, right? And I don't want to get into it. There's lots of arguments, for example, about Franco and was he good for the Jews or bad for the Jews, and there's a lot to explore there, and other people have done that work. But I think what is interesting for me is the way that Sephardi Jews get picked out as singular in some way, or better than other Jews. And it's because, one of the ways it operates, I argue, is that it turns them in, this kind of discourse turns them into Spaniards. It sort of claims them for Spain in a way that I think can't be done, for example, with Jews from Central and Eastern Europe.
No, I think this is one of the really powerful moments. I think some of the powerful things that in your work is this nuance. I think I'm really impressed by how you're really careful, and that shows how your ethnographic eye, your anthropological eye, you're really careful about these nuances. And that leads me to something that I really want you. I'm trying to think about the categories here, because
Sure.
categories later on will come back and to explain the law of 2015, to go back to your case study. So when I read your work, I don't see convivencia there at all. So why the choice? Why this choice to at least silence? And I know that you're not erasing it, but you're silencing that term for some reason. Why?
Oh, that's a good question. So, the debates about, I guess we could sort of separate them into two categories, the debates about convivencia. So, one is maybe the first level of historical debate, which is like what was, in medieval Spain, what was the nature of the relationship between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, right? That's sort of one question that many people have taken up. And then I think the other is, how have those debates or imaginings of convivencia sort of influence the present, influence the way that Spaniards and Jews and Muslims think about the past or participate in historical production. And in the book, I do talk quite a bit about ideas of convivencia, and in particular how certain cities, and in particular Cordoba, which is a place that I spent a lot of time, but also Toledo is another example, or Girona, are sort of styled as Jewish spaces, or depending, spaces of convivencia, spaces of the three religions or three peoples. But I think in my work on citizenship, I've tried to steer a little bit clear of that because I feel like those debates can sort of end up pulling so much attention to themselves that they get us away from how people themselves are thinking about the past. And I mean, it's just been such an area of scholarly foment for so long, and particularly in the Spanish context and exiled, Spanish thinkers. So I wanted to think much more about what does it mean so if you're a Sephardi descendant, what is it, when you think of the possibility of a return, whether it's a sort of metaphorical or literal one, what does that entail for you? What would need to be in place for you to feel comfortable or to feel like this was sufficient? So that's kind of like one part of the book, right? And that's what I've talked about a bit more today, is the citizenship. But another thing that I explore in the book is Spaniards who discover that they have Sephardic ancestry and decide to convert to Judaism. I spent a lot of time, my fieldwork, in conversion classes in synagogues and mainly in Madrid and Barcelona, but other places as well. And so there's another kind of return there, and that also ties into ideas about convivencia, but often it's less about medieval Spain and more about asserting a kind of political identity in the present, right? Whether it's about one's relationship to immigrants or to questions of race or gender and sexuality. I think there's another kind of convivencia maybe being acted out, but it's not quite the one that we're used to thinking about, right? The three religions.
That's great.
I don't know if that
no,
addresses
that's great. That's very, very helpful. Now I want to shift gears and move a little bit away from these historical moments and categories of analysis that you use to the present, to 2000, mostly to the near present, 2015, the law of 2015. And first of all, before we get to, I really like in your presentation how you try to engage with this notion of citizenship through this concept of reconciliation and reparation. I think it's the act, the text itself, and how people are responding to it. Does it go, how far it can go as far as accepting the injury that you talk about? And I think that's an interesting way of talking about this emotional response to people who reject it and the people who accept it. But before we get to these types of feelings, the typologies of feelings, if you can talk a little bit about why 2015, what triggered it? What is, because just as an anthropologist, trying to, before you started really doing this virtual ethnography and talking to people from all over the world, what do you think is triggered this moment?
Yeah, it's always, I think maybe not more for anthropologists, but certainly it's always a pressing one for us, right? Is the why now? Why is this particular historical moment contingent as it is? Why does it matter? Why did it take the shape that it did? And so there are a couple of answers. So one was that the Jewish community in Spain, which is quite small, it's usually estimated between 40 and 50,000 people. So compared to France, which is like 750,000 Jews, it's very small, or compared to the UK. But there's a small community there, and they had been pressing for years for a better process to potentially grant citizenship. So there was already a discretionary mechanism in place where people could apply on an individual basis. And one of the conditions for getting citizenship could be Sephardic ancestry. But again, it was on a case-by-case basis. And the Jewish community was pushing for something that was a little bit more expansive and would apply to more people. And in particular, the reason that they started doing this in the early 2000s was that they were concerned about the situation for Sephardi Jews living in Turkey and Venezuela. So that was a particular, as the political situation was deteriorating in both places, and the economic situation, particularly in Venezuela, this was one of the ways they saw that they could sort of offer support and solidarity and refuge potentially. So that was a big push. And then, there also had been, this other sort of long-standing, I think, fascination with Sephardic repatriation as a kind of state building. And when I think the alignment came when the Popular was in power, and there were people that were sympathetic to this idea, they worked together with the Jewish community to draft this legislation. Although, as people told me repeatedly, and I interviewed folks in the government, and I interviewed spent a lot of time with people in the Jewish community in Madrid and Barcelona. Jewish communities, the actual Sephardi diaspora weren't really consulted at all in terms of the conditions of the law, how it would work. So which is a little puzzling, or maybe not. But so I would say those are the two. There was a sort of already established idea that this was something that needed to be done. There was already, as you know, there was a measure in 1949. There was an earlier temporary measure that granted citizenship in 1924. It wasn't explicitly for Sephardi Jews, but in reality, that's who it helped, right? And in part, our colleague Sarah Stein in your department has also written about this as well. Mm-hmm. And then I think there was this other push from the Jewish community themselves that saw this as a way to help Sephardi Jews in other parts of the world.
That's great. So let's, if we can focus on the informants, quote unquote, the subject you've been talking to. So can you talk a little bit about the age? How many, how big is your sample, and how far, what countries it represents? Because I think that's, for me, or for a lot of readers, would potentially, just like what you just mentioned, as far as these two cases, one from the case, especially the case from New York, and the case from from Venezuela.
Someone who living in New York, but he had roots in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and then one living in the US also, but has roots in Venezuela. Yeah. So that, I think it's really important that, as far as how people would move and what would lead, because your project is also about migration and circulation and mobility. And the potential of mobility. So what is your sample? If you can talk a little bit more about the breadth of your sample.
Sure. So I mean, I would bracket this by saying, perhaps as an anthropologist very much in the tradition of social and cultural anthropology, I tend not to see it in terms of sample size. However, that is not obviously how many people one spends time with and talks to, and how they're positioned matters in a very fundamental way. So I mean, I spoke with some people that were applying for this or knew about it and were not applying, who had been living in Spain, who were from the US, who were from Israel, who were from Latin America. And I spoke with a lot of people who were living in other countries. Israel, I spoke with a number of people from Turkey, from Venezuela, UK, a number of people in the Southwest of the US, right, who were part of the Hispano community there and have strong ties. So I did not speak with folks from every country that applied, but I would say certainly the ones that had the largest numbers of applicants. And I did that sort of very much through word of mouth, also through very active online communities on Facebook and Twitter and places like that for people who were applying. And folks just started referring me to other people, and that's how that often went. And in terms of age, it ranged from people in their early 20s to their late 70s. I spoke with slightly more men than women, as far as I know. Those were the gender categories in play. No one I spoke with that I know of identified as non-binary or genderqueer. And there certainly was, a difference, for example, for someone who was coming from Venezuela, where the possibility of gaining the citizenship could truly be a life or death situation, or a second chance versus catastrophe. And there are certainly people, again, in Turkey, who saw this as a way into the EU and an escape from an increasingly authoritarian state. And then there were people for whom this mattered, perhaps if it did it all in a different way. Perhaps it was more so the difficulty I have here is there's this, what I found in my research is when people ascribe both motivations to the state, to Spain, and when they talk about their own motivations for applying or not applying, they often use this sort of dichotomy of sincere or insincere, or romantic or pragmatic. And so I think it's important to recognize that, but I also don't want to like repeat it myself, in my own work. But those were certainly some of the ways that people were thinking about a citizenship maybe that was necessary or required or potentially life-changing versus one that felt perhaps restorative or emotional or sentimental. And so, yeah, people, and it also varied in terms of generation. So I think younger folks that I spoke to, people in their 20s and 30s, were much more likely to talk about the mobility that an EU, passport in an EU country would afford them. And I think people in older generations were more likely to talk about it in terms of a connection to Spain or Portugal or to their Sephardic heritage. And then the other thing that was thrown in the mix was this sort of, right in 2015, 2016, there's this kind of global explosion of sort of right-wing populist movements. And so that also, people begin to see in the US as well, in the US and the UK, begin to see this as, well, maybe this is a potential backup plan if things get bad, right? And there was, in fact, I think when there was, after Brexit, there was something like an 80-fold increase in the number of applications to Portugal from Sephardic Jews in Britain. So there's a lot of different factors kind of converging in sometimes in unexpected ways.
No, this is what makes this project really fascinating. So I'm aware of time, but I have two questions left.
Sure.
So if you don't mind, I've been doing a project here on the Moroccan Jewish community in LA, and one of the individuals I interviewed a few years ago was talking. I actually asked him, because he's got a Sephardi descent, he's originally from Larash, from northern Morocco, and asked him about the potential of basically applying for the citizenship, and he categorically said no. And I said, why? And this has to do with a word that you used in your presentation. He said, well, it's a poisoned gift. I was very shocked, but it's really fascinating the way you highlight Marcel Mauss' idea of the gift, and then the rejection of the gift, and how far you can go as far as rejecting this gift. So and it becomes a performance in light of, for instance, Susan Slamovic's work on human rights as a performance in when it comes to the way the Moroccan state dealt with the years of Leve and the human rights abuse over decades. So I think this, for me, and I want to hear more about your thoughts here. For me, when I put together these vignettes, these three vignettes that you mentioned, these two vignettes that you mentioned in your presentation, I think a problem, and you already touched upon this. The problem of this law is that it is coming from one player. It never involved. It's not a discussion between two partners. And I think that's why your conversation or your discussion of the gift is, I think it's a fascinating proposal there, as how do you approach this as a gift or not?
Yeah, I mean, in this thinking about the gift, I'm very much indebted to the work of Audra Simpson, who I mentioned, who's written so beautifully about citizenship and sovereignty for indigenous folks in the U.S. And our colleague Carol McGranahan has written about this in relation to Tibetans and exile. And I find the gift a really helpful way of thinking about the different kinds of obligations that are included or not included with the offer of citizenship, right? And so when it's framed by the state essentially as something benevolent, right, that the state is doing, that people should be grateful for, and that we can sort of put this whole business of the Inquisition to rest now. That's when I think it's helpful to think about the gift, because a right endures, or theoretically, right, endures, whereas a gift has a different kind of temporality, and there's always some sort of contractual exchange or expectations which may be mutually misrecognized, which I think is part of what's happening with people who refuse. But when there's a gift, there's the potential for a kind of clash in understanding. And the Portuguese version of this is imperfect too, but one of the things that really sets them apart is that it's ongoing. The Portuguese law, people can still apply for this. There are fewer requirements. And the fact that the Spanish law was originally 3 years, and then there was this provision that allowed it to be extended for a year, which happened. So it ended up being a 4-year window. And so, if the state is really committed to this, people kept, one of the frustrations I had in reading the way the law was being covered in the press, and the way even many people in my fieldwork spoke about it, was as if it were a right of return, and it isn't that. And I suspect that at some point in the future it will be revisited. The previous mechanism, the discretionary mechanism, is still on the books. So there still is a way for people to apply for the law, but it's more complicated and people are less likely to use it. And something that's come up recently, which you may have seen, was a big article came out I think it was in August, about all of a sudden, there was a giant backlog because of COVID, et cetera. And many people were being, huge numbers of people were being rejected for the law. Or in some cases, I remember in a Zoom workshop I attended, a woman spoke who had moved she'd actually, one of the few people who had actually relocated to Spain and was living there with her children, had citizenship and had it revoked. Because the Ministry of Justice claims that people were admitted who shouldn't have been admitted, that there was fraud, which may well be true. A lot of people made a lot of money, lawyers in particular, through this process. But so I think there's another interesting chapter in this story that's kind of unfolding now is, so, if I spoke about people who refused, there are all these people who accepted and applied and either thought they had it and were later had it revoked, or were rejected on grounds, that they find illegitimate or insincere. And there's this question of, is this anti-Semitism? Is this, what is fueling this current round? And I think the jury's still out on that. I haven't been able to do field work in 3 years. In person, I hope to be returning to Spain this summer and exploring this as it unfolds, because there really is a lot of anger among Sephardi folks in the diaspora about the way the law has been working or has not been working, really.
Wow, that's okay. It's your mistake. You mentioned one word there. So I have to, instead of I just said 2 questions, supposed to have one last question, but I think we have now 2 now, because you mentioned, I think for the sake of, for our audience, if you can say a little bit, what's different? For which citizenship you have more applications? Is it the Portuguese or the Spanish? That's my first question. And my last question, I'll ask them together, is I think what, for me as an anthropologist, but also somebody who's interested in this whole question of Spain and Morocco and their connections to their Jewish communities, I really like how you approach this really complicated topic by focusing on language but also a relationship between language and emotions and how people express their emotions. And I think your approach is very powerful. So if you can say more about why did you make that choice of focusing on affect as one?
Sure.
And within that, sorry, I'm going to embed another point,
sure,
which has to do with which is a question that a lot of people ask throughout North Africa, for instance, and why Muslims, why people from are not part of this law.
Yeah.
So is it if Spain is trying to be, or if Portugal and Spain are trying to be more philo-Semitic, are they still maintaining their quote unquote Islamophobic approach to Muslims who were expelled too from that part of the world? So we have three questions, and then sorry.
So I'll say off the bat, I don't have, and this is, I guess, partially attributed to my sort of ongoing COVID brain fog. I don't have the comparative numbers off the top of my head for Spain and Portugal. I know that, so when the law ended for Spain in October 1st, 2019, it was somewhere around 132,000 applications. And I want to say that almost half of those had come in the last few months. I mean, it was a dramatic uptick, but at the end, it was still much lower than expected. And there's another, there's thousands more that are sort of still in process, I believe. And every month there are these updates that come out from the state, but I don't know the current numbers, and I do not know the numbers for Portugal. I am some of this research is in a book that's coming out by a number of scholars on both the Portuguese and Spanish laws. That's really a kind of comparative effort that's edited by Dalia Candiote and Rina Aomar. And I think that will happen sometime in 2022. And that project is very much about people who are experts from different fields and on Portugal and on Spain thinking together about how the laws work or don't work. So okay, language and emotion. So I guess I have two answers to that. I mean, one is that my training as an anthropologist was very much on race and on sentiment and emotions and thinking about affect. That was a big part of my training. It was something that I was already interested in, and I see as central to governance, past and present. I think states are always invested in emotions and trying to cultivate certain ones and dissuade others. But also, I was just led to it through my field work. I mean, the language and my archival research, the emotions were so much. Emotions and affect and sentiment were so much of what people were talking about. And I remember going back and reading, the Angel Pulido, who's the sort of architect of the first kind of major Sephardic repatriation effort, was a prolific writer, and he assembled many of his letters to Sephardic communities in the Balkans and other places. And throughout his work and that of other, what I would say, philo-Sephardites, over and over and over again, there's all this talk about emotion, particularly rancor. So my most recent article focuses on that because it's such a rancor. Like why rancor? And it's invoked over and over again as this sort of possibility, but then almost in this kind of anxious way, as like, well, there's no way the Jews feel rancor about the expulsion. They're fine with it. They want to be part of Spain. It's almost as if it's something that agents of the state are telling themselves to feel better. But it's also the language that people spoke to me in my fieldwork about love, about nostalgia. Rancor was not used as much, but there was this kind of language about injury, and so people look for terms that either in some way connect to their connections to the state or to a larger Jewish community, but also their connections to ideas of justice, and emotion is often is a go-to for that. And then to your last point, I think for me, and I say this in the Rancor article, it's really important to frame this this citizenship law in relationship to those it excludes, right? So in relationship to Muslim and Maurice descendants who are excluded from the law, and therefore also in terms of the ongoing sort of way in which Jews and Muslims or Jews and Arabs are positioned in debates about who counts as European and who deserves reparations. And so I think it's always important that this be located in terms of not only is this law selective inclusion within the group that it says deserves some kind of reparations, but it excludes so many people. And this was something that was discussed and debated in Congress during several iterations of the law. And in my Ranker article, I looked very closely at some of these conversations, and there were politicians who argued that this law was insufficient if it didn't include the descendants of Muslims who were expelled, or if it didn't address the question of Western Sahara and Spain's colonial relationship. So those were debated, but ultimately they were put to the side. The law was unanimously approved. Mm-hmm. And I think it was able to do so because there was this promise, well, we'll get to these. These aren't related issues. We'll get to these later. And I think they're central. I think one of the things that to me is interesting about the path that this law has taken is not just because I'm a student of Spanish history and Jewish history and the contemporary ways in which Spanish and Jewish worlds are connected, but also how it speaks to the ongoing kind of, I hate to use the word crisis, but sort of agonizing debates about multiculturalism in Europe and what kind of Europe do people want and who does it include? And I think Spain offers a different vantage maybe than we often get on those questions. It was a very long answer.
Yeah, no, this is great. No, this is great. On that note, Cam, I want to thank you on behalf of the UCLA L&D Leve Center for Jewish Studies and on behalf of the Maurice Amado program in Sephardic Studies. It was a joy and a pleasure to have you and to talk to you about your work. I really encourage everybody to read your really excellent article on Ranker and the Sephardi Jews, Spanish citizenship, and the politics of sentiment that is published in Comparative Studies in Society and History. And we're really looking forward to your book. I'm really looking forward to this book. I think it is really a change in work that's going to add more to this conversation about not only Sephardic studies, but also Jewish-Muslim relations, Spanish-Moroccan relations, and Jews in the larger Mediterranean world too. So thank you. And
thank you so much.
And looking forward to talking to you and seeing you in person in the future.
Thank you very much. This is a real pleasure.
Take care.
All right. Have a good one.